The neighbors no longer wondered about Arthur Mallory. They had, once. In the first few years after he returned to town, there were soft murmurs at the diner and sideways glances outside the post office. Children warned each other in hushed tones to steer clear of the mute man's house, as if his silence was something contagious or enchanted. But that was a long time ago. Enough years had passed that curiosity gave way to quiet respect. More like reverence, really. It wasn't that people liked him necessarily. It's that they sensed, instinctively, that his silence had weight. Not absence, but presence. Like a tombstone planted in the middle of a garden. Mr. Mallory folks called him Art, though no one could recall ever hearing him say it himself. Lived alone in a squat cottage just off Little River Road, nestled between a hickory grove and a murmuring stream. He'd been there for over 30 years, in that modest, vine-wrapped house with its crooked mailbox and never quite straight picket fence. The American flag out front never drooped, not even in winter. Art made sure of that. Every morning at precisely 6:45, he took a walk. He never missed a day, not even in sleet. He'd walk from his gate, take a right onto the gravel shoulder of the road, and pace a loop through the woods and back. His posture was proud, even regal always, upright, shoulders square. But his eyes rarely met yours. He visited the corner store once a week Tuesdays, around 10:30. Never spoke. Nod of the head. Exact change. Sometimes he'd pause by the old magazine rack, staring, not because he was reading necessarily, but because the pages were filled with color and noise, and he seemed to be deciding how much of either he could absorb. He was not an unfriendly man, nor was he unkind, just quiet. Not the sort of quiet that precedes speech, but the kind that replaces it. A quiet that lived in you so deep, you forgot it wasn't your own. What the town didn't remember, or maybe never knew, was that Arthur Mallory had once been full of song. Not just laughter, but song. In 1966, he'd sung in his college quartet, harmonizing like a barbershop angel. Sang jazz at open mic nights with a voice like honey dipped in bourbon. He wrote lyrics that made his professor cry, poems that wept or danced depending on where you broke the line. Then the war came, and when he returned, he didn't. They told stories, the folks in town, that his voice had been damaged by a landmine, that he'd taken a vow of silence for religious reasons, that someone he loved had broken his heart so deeply, speaking became salt in the wound. Art never corrected any of them. He didn't even shake his head when the grocery clerk speculated aloud, a young kid, rude without knowing it. Art had simply slid his oatmeal across the counter, offered a slow wrap-around smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, paid in silence, and left. Those eyes, though people remembered, those grey, stony, searching, like two storm clouds waiting for the right wind to empty them. He kept a garden in back of his house, small but meticulous. Carrots, radishes, snap peas. Every spring he planted just 5 tomato plants, never more, staked in a tidy arc to catch the sun. He kept a journal, though no one ever saw him writing. Just a black notebook under his arm during his walks, folded like it belonged there. Rumor had it he used to write music, but that had stopped long ago. Locals said he wasn't broken, just paused, as though life had hit play in his youth, and then the tape jammed. He still moved, still ate, still slept, but everything played in slow motion. With the sound turned all the way down, children stopped being afraid of him, eventually. Older ones waved at him during his walks. Some said he tipped his head in return. One 12-year-old girl swore he once winked, made her weak. There was something in his stillness people trusted, something safe, steadfast, like the way old trees never ask questions, but seem to understand your thoughts anyway. Still, no one really knew him. Not for decades, but he was loved. In a way, quietly. The florists left him a bright potted orchid every Veterans Day. Kids sometimes dropped off painted rocks on his walkway, as if offering him small, wordless gifts. The town had accepted him as part of their ecosystem, neither fully theirs nor fully gone. If you asked anyone why Arthur Mallory didn't speak, they'd shrug and say, the war, probably. But that wasn't the whole story, because silence isn't always born in trauma. Sometimes it grows out of loss, a kind of erosion that happens quietly, breath by breath, until the voice doesn't seem gone, just inappropriate, like reaching for laughter at a funeral, or singing in a crater. And that's where Art lived. Inside that crater, peaceful, perhaps, but barren, life passed him and over him. He watched from beside the road until the storm, until the sound, until the softest meow broke through the hardest silence. He would not know it at the time, not fully. But that November evening, wind screaming like a memory, rain beating like a desperate hand on a locked door, that was the moment everything began to change, and it started, quite impossibly, with a whisper under the shed. They used to say Art Mallory could make anything into a verse. As a boy, he'd stuff his school notebooks with lyrics, scribbled between math assignments and grammar drills. His teachers thought he might go on to be something, maybe a songwriter, or a poet if he could figure out how to eat off rhyme schemes and metaphors. Back then, his voice was a thing of note. Warm, playful, always humming. He'd whistle down the school hallways, sing harmonies at backyard bonfires, entertain his mother while helping with chores, crooning Nat King Cole while drying dishes. He had a knack for weaving humor into melody, like knocking on a hollow log in rhythm while he sang blues about his homework being eaten by a dog, which it never was. He smiled often, laughed harder. By 18, he'd written a whole collection of songs, most of them hopelessly romantic. Ode to a girl named Linda, who worked Saturdays at the sandwich counter. Sonnet for the third snowfall of junior year. He read books about Haight-Ashbury, but the Pacific never called him. Duty did. Belief did. It was 1968 when he joined the army. Just after his freshman year of college, he told his parents it'd make a man out of him. Told Linda he'd be back in a year and a half. Tops. They both cried at the station. Vietnam was already halfway into chaos when Art stepped off the transport. That summer, first thing he noticed was the heat. It clung like wet fabric, tight and relentless. Second was the smell: diesel, sweat, smoke, the soft rot of jungle life underfoot. Third was the silence between bursts of sound, long stretches of nothing, punctuated by chaos. He was assigned to a reconnaissance unit in the Central Highlands. The days were long and strange, full of waiting and swatting mosquitoes and carving initials into rifle straps. Nights were worse. You learned to sleep lightly, to interpret the difference between wind and footstep. Jamie was the one who made it bearable. Jamie Dunlop from Chicago, serious jazz nut. Couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but loved music like religion. He was loud in the mess tent, softer in the jungle. They paired oddly well: Art with his quiet poetry, Jamie with his brash jokes and constant humming of sax solos. They traded stories, shared smokes, and made each other laugh. It felt almost normal, almost home. Jamie had a sister, he said. Art had a notebook full of lyrics. They promised to meet in New Orleans someday, play at an open mic, and drink something stupidly strong. When they talked under the stars with the static of a far-off radio in the background, the war felt miles away. Until it WASN, single quotes, no one speaks much about what happens when missions go wrong. Not in the ways that count. Officially, there was enemy. Fire, a misstep in the dark. Too much cover, too little visibility. A radio signal that cracked instead of transmitting. Just static when they needed clarity. Unofficially, what Art remembered was the sound of Jamie's voice calling his name. Just before the blast, a flash, then dust, then blood, then silence. He made it out with cracked ribs and shrapnel in his leg. But something else broke too. Something untouched by fire or steel. Something that doesn't show on a scan. He was evacuated, treated, told he was lucky, then discharged and sent home. But he didn't feel lucky. He didn't feel anything. At first, at the airport, no one met him. He hadn't told them he was coming. In the taxi, the city felt foreign, too loud, too fast. He flinched when someone shouted, stared too long at a crumpled soda can rattling down a drain. It sounded like gunfire in disguise. He didn't go back to school. Said it wasn't time. Didn't return Linda's letters. Too many feelings, too many questions, and he had no answers. Just Jamie's voice, echoing into memory. Just the taste of dirt and fire and stillness. Therapy didn't help. Not that he didn't try, he did. Several times. Sat in cushioned chairs while well-meaning voices asked how he felt. He'd shrugged, say nothing. Not out of defiance, but because there weren't any words he trusted. Medications came next. They dulled the edge, sometimes, but also blurred him, made the days feel underwater. Support groups were too loud, too blunt. Some told stories that made him sweat through his shirt. Others said things that made him angry, and that felt worse, so he withdrew, slowly, consistently, until one day he noticed he hadn't actually spoken in over a week, then a month. His voice sat shallow in his chest, rising only to clear his throat, but never enough to speak. Not aloud. The silence wasn't scary though. It was comforting, in a way. Like laying under a weighted blanket in a storm. As if noise and chaos couldn't find him there. Every word felt like a risk. Every sound an opening. So he closed them off. He bought a home in the town he was born in, far from freeways and air bases, just 5 minutes walk from the woods. His parents had moved away by then. Linda had married. The world had kept turning. Inside that cottage, silence reigned. No radio, no TV, just the drowsy tick of a grandfather clock and the hum of the fridge when it remembered to run. He didn't feel lonely. Not exactly, just reduced. Paused, the way a song might fall silent between verses. The world, for the most part, agreed to let him be. Veterans like him were tucked away on the edges of conversations, honored but not queried, saluted but not listened to. So Art learned how to be invisible, how to walk quietly, how to exist in the corners of spaces where no one asked questions with their voice, only with their eyes, and those he'd long since learned to avoid. But silence, like any habit, becomes structure, and Art had built a whole life from it. A quiet house, a quiet routine, a quiet sadness that didn't cry it, merely settled like ash in the corners. And when people left gifts on his porch or drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk outside, he said nothing, of course, but something inside him would ache. The wind that night didn't so much blow as howl. It wrapped around Arthur's little cottage with the hunger of something half-remembered, tugging at the gutters and rattling the screen door like it had been forgotten on the wrong side of home. Rain slapped the windows, jagged and insistent, and the trees creaked like old bones. Inside, it was quiet, always quiet. Art sat in his usual chair near the fireplace, though the flames were just embers now. A navy wool blanket over his knees. The lights were off except for the lamp in the corner, warm gold cast wide across the wooden floor, flickering slightly as the wind found its way down through the chimney flue. He had just closed his eyes, half prayer, half rest, when the sound came. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks. A low whimper, high-pitched and distant, nearly consumed by the rain. He shifted slightly in his seat, listening. Nothing. Then, again a thread of sound, thin and pleading, somewhere just beyond the back door. Art's eyebrows knit. He stood, slow from the stiffness of 70-odd years and a leg that never quite forgave him. He moved to the kitchen, barefoot, and opened the back door a cautious inch. Rain hit his face, cold and sharp. The wind moaned like a lost train, but there it was, louder now. A cry, definitely an animal, small, frightened, too fragile for this storm. For a long moment, Art stood in the doorway, hand on the knob, heart suddenly loud inside his chest. He didn't move. This was when he should have shut the door again, pushed the lock, returned to his chair and forgotten the sound. He did not. Instead, he reached for the flashlight by the back window, fumbled into his boots, ignored the aching in his knee, pulled the collar of his flannel shirt tight around his neck, and stepped into the dark. The backyard was a mess of shadows. His tomato beds lay bare, stripped by autumn, the compost being clattered in the wind. Rain flooded the flagstones, pooled at the foot of his lilac tree. The cry came again, left side, toward the shed. It was a sway-backed old thing with warped wood, and a padlock that had rusted shut 3 springtimes ago. Art followed the beam of his flashlight, shoes sinking slightly into the sponge of soft ground, and there, under the far corner, wedged between a warped plank and the cement base, something moved. He crouched, brow knit, a kitten, small, drenched, curled into a trembling comma. Orange and white fur soaked clear through, huge ears flattened against its skull. Mewing barely audible over the storm, Art blinked. Rain streaked into his collar. The beam of the flashlight flickered once. He should walk away, let nature take its course. But he didn't. He set the flashlight down and lowered himself carefully to the wet ground. Reached out a single hand. "Hey," he rasped before the word even registered. It escaped him like a cough, not on purpose, just forced up from wherever sound had gone to sleep inside him. The kitten didn't run. Its eyes flared big and glassy, but it didn't stop crying. Slowly, slowly, Art coaxed it forward. Must have taken 5 long minutes. But finally, those tiny paws stepped out from under the shed and into his waiting towel. He wrapped her gently, as if afraid the storm might snatch her away. She mewed once, sharply, then nestled into the fabric. He didn't know why, but his breath caught, just for a second. A lump, dry and sudden, in his throat. Somewhere behind it, a memory stirred, but not clearly. Just the sense of something loose and old rattling in the attic of his mind. Back inside. He towel-dried her the best he could on the kitchen counter, moving with a care that surprised even him. She looked impossibly small on that old butcher. Block, fur matted, tail twitching. But her eyes, though, stayed fixed on him. Deep gold, questioning. He didn't speak. Just made a small sound, half laugh, half say as she pressed her forehead into the back of his hand. For the first time in years, that sigh made noise. It filled the space somewhere between breath and voice, and echoed briefly in the quiet kitchen. She purred a single, tiny rumble, that motor-borne thrum that kittens use in place of thank you. It cracked gently into his bones. He placed her gently on the chair by the fire, dried off her ears with an old hand towel. She didn't resist, curled into a ball and closed her eyes, completely trusting Dot. Art stood there a while, watching her sleep. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cottage, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, just a small hinge turning. A door he hadn't stepped toward in a long, long time. He poured himself a cup of tea that had gone cold, sat down across from her, and for no reason he could explain, he did not pick up his book or his journal. He just sat, listened to the rain, watched her breathe, and the silence, for once, did not hurt. He didn't name her. Not at first. She was just the little one. A silent term passed between his thoughts whenever she nudged his ankle or curled beside him in the evenings. A designation of sorts, not a bond, not yet. She stayed close from the moment he brought her in. Slept tucked by the hearth that first night like she'd been born there. The next morning, he found her pawing at the hem of his flannel shirt, tiny mews rattling from her throat like wind chimes with only half the notes. He made no sound in return, just scooped her up and placed her gently on the windowsill to watch. The wet trees dripped Dot over the first week. She made herself known. Not by force, but by persistence. Knocked over a coaster, climbed into his laundry basket, tried to walk across his toast, blatantly, without apology. When he sat on the porch in the morning, she curled into the crook of his elbow. When he walked to the garden, she followed, tripping over her own tail. He remained quiet, always quiet, but his silences changed shape. No longer walls, they bent at the edges, let in curious thoughts, allowed for sentences inside his head that hadn't existed in years. She started to wait for him by the door. Every morning at 6:45, her tail flicking with impatience like a metronome. He'd open the door and she would trail him halfway down the lane, then stop and watch, ears upright, until he looped back. He never addressed her, only glanced down occasionally to make sure she hadn't gotten too close to the road in the evenings. She lay on the arm of his chair as he read. Once, he read the same line 4 times and still couldn't retain it, because she'd begun batting a strip of thread hanging from his sleeve. He didn't shoo her, and she purred at night now. Loud, contented rumbles, as if the house had remembered how to hum. It was Tuesday when it first happened, just past 10:30. Same pattern as always. He headed into the corner, store cap lowered, collar up. He gathered oatmeal, a tin of sardines, his weekly newspaper, as he reached up to grab a small can of beans off the shelf. Something caught at the edge of his sleeve. Back home, only minutes earlier, little one had nearly knocked over his mug, chasing a fly that wasn't there. He'd watched, unimpressed, and at the moment her paw sent the mug wobbling off the table and into shattering oblivion. He heard himself say it. "Oh, come on." His voice soft, not startled, not crafted, just there. It stopped him flat. The sound echoed in the kitchen, bounced once and disappeared. He hadn't meant to speak, hadn't realized he had. The kitten had stilled, ears forward, and blinked at him. He stared back, then cleared his throat, slowly. That, too, made noise. He crouched to pick up the shard of the broken mug, glass still slick with pale dregs of tea, and held the largest piece in his hand for a long moment. There was no ceremony, no joy, but beneath his ribs some muscle twitched that hadn't in years. Noise, speech, it was not a chisel cracking stone, just a breath followed by sound, but it had come from within him, not involuntary, not forced, something like a choice, or maybe like a reflex. He wasn't sure which yet. The kitten licked her paw. The clerk at the store noticed his eyes looked different that morning. Not warm, necessarily, but less armored. When Art handed him the exact change, their fingers brushed, still mute, still silent, but a silence with shape now, like listening at a closed door and finally catching the scent of soup on the other side. At night, she sat on his lap and pawed at the corner of his book until he closed it. She had a fondness for interrupting his habits. She'd learned where he kept the paper filters and would drag them across the counter like parade banners. When she tried to bat a grape off the ledge one afternoon, he almost chuckled, and he thought for the first time in a while about names. He didn't say them aloud, not yet, but he turned them like stones in his palm. Mirth, Comet, Pip, Boots. None felt right then. One morning, while trimming the rose bushes, she sprang up onto his shoulder and pressed her nose under his chin with something like a startled sneeze. Her long whiskers tickled the soft skin of his neck, and he exhaled, surprised. "Whiskers," he said under his breath. Just one word, and then again, a little louder, not to test it, but to say it to her. Whiskers looked up from the windowsill as if summoned. He repeated it once more, then shook his head, half smiling. "Troublemakers more like it," he mumbled. But the name stuck. In his journal that night, he didn't write a poem. He wrote what he remembered of the sound his voice had made, and under it, the name, Whiskers. He'd given something of himself again, not just to the cat, but to the world. A word, a spoken word, and it didn't hurt, not the way he feared it might. The house had changed. It wasn't the furniture, or the light, or the rugs, though those had shifted too. Subtly, in small ways only Art would notice. The folded blanket on the armchair had acquired a dusting of orange fur. His slippers were often misplaced, stolen to a corner by mischievous paws. His windowsills were smudged now, patched with the invisible imprint of a cat's daily patrol. But deeper than that, the silence had changed flavor. Once stale, like old bread left too long in a tin. Now it was warm, alive. Whiskers filled it with movement, with sound. The gentle pat-pat of her feet on the floor. The rustle of newspaper when she pounced from behind his chair. The purrs, steady. As a metronome rising from his lap in the afternoon, he found himself humming again. Not deliberately. It started with a few notes fragments of a melody he'd once loved. He was sweeping the porch when it tumbled out of him, something 1950s. Radio played and honey sweet. He paused, broom still in hand, lips parted. Suddenly aware of his own sound, Whiskers blinked at him from under the wicker table. He cleared his throat and kept sweeping. But later, he sang the whole first verse to himself while watering the radishes. And that evening, when she wouldn't stop chasing the drawstring of his hoodie, he actually laughed and called her a nuisance to her face. She meowed back. A negotiation. "Fine," he said, tossing her the string. "You win." It didn't occur to him until later that he'd spoken. Twice, clearly. For the first time in years, he didn't tell anyone. But he felt it settle inside him like an exhale that had waited too long to arrive. He wrote again, properly. It started as a letter to Jamie. He hadn't written to him since the war, not in any way that counted. But that day, with whiskers curled, in a shoebox beside the window, he opened his old journal and began. Dear Jamie, her name is Whiskers. She came in from the storm. You would have loved her. The words came slowly, not like the verses he used to dash off with afternoon sunlight crowding his desk. These words came in pieces, jagged and raw, like cracked sea glass. He wrote about the quiet, the kind that drowned and the kind that healed. He wrote about the first sound that mattered again, a meow so small it could have been ignored, but wasn't. He wrote until the porch light blinked on, and the page filled with ink that was more feeling than sentence. On Wednesday, he greeted the clerk at the corner store. Morning, he said, just the one word. The kid blinked, startled, then grinned like he'd won something. You too, Mr. Mallory. Art nodded. His chest felt strange on the way home, light and heavy at once. He joined the gardening club the next week. A flyer in the library had mentioned it. Seniors Grow Together, a title both corny and sincere. He hadn't meant to take it seriously, but he found himself staring at the email address printed small in the bottom corner, as if waiting for permission. He sent a message from the library desktop in 6 words. Can I still grow tomatoes there? They wrote back, absolutely. Bring your hands and a hat. He didn't bring a hat. Ended up borrowing one there. The other gardeners were kind talkative, mostly with hands that looked like they'd spent decades building small things. Whiskers didn't attend, but she made herself useful in another way. She began sitting beside his typewriter at night, like a muse made of fur, her tail tapping to some rhythm he hadn't yet written. They developed routines. He narrated her morning, adventures in low tones while he made his toast. There she goes, he'd say, as she darted through the living room after nothing in particular. World's tiniest thunderstorm. He told her stories, old ones, about his college days and his mother's lasagna, and that one time Jamie fainted after getting his ear pierced. Some evenings, he'd read her the weather forecast like it was poetry. She always listened. At the vet, when she went for her shots, the receptionist asked her name. He didn't hesitate. Whiskers, he said. She lives up to it. The vet offered a small nod. Seems like she keeps you company. She does, Art replied, softly. Every day. Once, a reporter from the local paper visited the shelter while Art was volunteering. They asked why he'd started helping. He gestured toward the shy cat in the far corner they'd been socializing. She told me too, he said. The reporter smirked. The cat did. Art shrugged. Well, the first one did. The article came out 2 Sundays later. Title: The Man Who Found His Voice Through a Kitten. Whiskers was pictured, looking regal and wholly unimpressed. The quote was printed in bold. Some things don't need words to say everything. Kids started leaving drawings on his porch, little portraits of Whiskers, battles with yarn or sailing toy boats in teacups. Art tacked the best ones to the fridge. The silence in the house became dappled with crayons and quiet laughter. That's when he reached out to his daughter. 15 years is a long time. He wrote a letter first, included a photograph. Whiskers was front and center on the chair beside him, tiny tongue mid-lick, his face aged but open. I have a cat now, the note said. Her name is Whiskers. She talks more than I do, but I'm learning. He mailed it. A reply came 3 weeks later. She wanted to see him, maybe talk, just talk. He sat with Whiskers on the porch the evening her message arrived. "She's not going to believe how much you've wrecked the couch," he said, scratching. Behind her ears, Whiskers purred in reply. That night, before bed, he wrote a poem, just 8 lines, uneven meter, but full of breath, about the storm and the door, and the meow, about the way a heart can remember how to speak even if it starts with a whisper. He began to refer to it as Whiskers' idea. The volunteering, that is. The decision came quietly, like most of his choices, now formed not in sudden epiphany, but in the lingering warmth of her presence after she curled beside him during a storm. The thought had come as he watched her bat softly at a fly trapped against the window. If she could trust the world after being left in it, maybe so could he. The shelter was 15 minutes away, tucked behind the high school and across from the bakery with the perpetually crooked sign. The woman at the front desk, Chloe's, early 60s, the kind of demeanor worn soft from years of lifting cages and warming formula, asked him why he was there. "I have some time," he said. He wasn't sure what else to say. But by the end of the week, he had cleaned 4 litter boxes, comforted to anxious beagles, and given a shy grey tabby enough space to blink in peace. He came back the next week, and the next. Whiskers waited for him each time, tail flicking like a metronome when he returned. Stepping through the door with the ghost of dander on his sleeves and the quiet before stories in the corners of his eyes at the VA clinic. He started telling other vets about Whiskers in small, deliberate pieces. Not over coffee or group sessions. Those still made his spine coil, but at the bulletin board in the lobby. He overheard a younger vet grumbling about the noise in his apartment one day, and Art simply said, "A kitten helps." The man frowned. Art smiled. "No one expects anything from a kitten, just your lap and your warmth." A few weeks later, someone pinned up a flyer for a rescue adoption day, and the title caught Art's eye: "Silent Partners, Companion Pets for Combat Veterans." He recognized himself in the phrase, though nobody had said it out loud. They asked him to speak at the event, just a few words. He couldn't imagine standing behind a podium, couldn't imagine a microphone, but he didn't want to say no either, so he stood on the grass, next to a folding table scattered with brochures and plastic bowls. He cleared his throat as a handful of people gathered near. Whiskers sat in a harness on the table beside him, as if noting the crowd with detached feline interest. "She saved my life," he said, quietly. Some heads tilted. Art looked down at her. Not all at once, not with drama, just one meow at a time. That was all he said. But after, 2 people asked about adoption. One young man cried when he held an orange kitten with a missing tail. Another smiled just watching them. Whiskers licked her paw, unimpressed by her own reputation. The article from the newspaper, they printed it again. Syndicated, this time in a regional magazine that landed in waiting rooms and diners all across the county. Art's picture was small, in black and white. The headline read, "From Silence to Song, One Veteran's Healing Through Fur and Friendship." Soon, people recognized him. Children waved on his walks. One boy asked if Whiskers was magic. Art bent low and said, "If you believe in kindness, then yes." Teachers invited him to speak at the elementary school. He declined at first. Then he agreed to visit, not to speak, just to show the kids Whiskers and let them pet her soft ears and laugh when she insisted on climbing into everyone's laps. That day, one girl whispered, "I didn't think old people could smile that much." Whiskers slept for 13 hours after. Art began writing poems again. Not full volumes, just fragments. A stanza in the middle of a grocery list. A haiku, scrawled beside a soup recipe. They all revolved around the same themes. Pause on window panes, soft snores, sunbeams, and second chances. One poem ended like this: "She did not ask my sorrow's shape. She curled inside it just the same, breathed warmth into its vacant room, and left it glowing, not with flame, but fur." The name Whiskers began to appear in conversations on the town Facebook page. She was invited as a guest of honor, no less to the preschool's Gentle Friends Day. Art smiled when he read the invitation, folded it 3 times neatly, and pinned it beside the kitchen calendar. But the most unexpected moment came in a letter. One from his daughter. She wrote cautiously, not formal, but careful, like a hand, tracing old maps in candlelight. "I'd like to meet her," it said. "And you, if you're okay with that." He stared at the envelope for a long time, then read it aloud to Whiskers, who offered no opinion, only closed eyes and twitching whiskers that seemed to say, "About time." Art cleaned the living room twice. He ironed his best flannel, combed his hair, polished the brass latch on the letterbox for the first time in 15 years. When she arrived, Whiskers trotted to the door first, rubbed her head against the woman's ankle like she'd been expecting her all week. His daughter crouched. "So this is who I have to thank," she said. Art opened his mouth to speak. What came out was a whisper. "Yeah." A pause passed between them. He smiled. "She's insistent," he added. His daughter's smile matched his. They sat on the porch with tea. Whiskers watched the wind in the leaves, purring like a metronome for a story not quite finished, but more than ready to begin. Again. It started in spring, a few missed jumps, a softer step. Whiskers began to hesitate before leaping from the windowsill to the arm of Art's chair. She would reach out with her paw, touch the edge, then settle back down instead, old habits slowing. Into caution, Art noticed immediately. He didn't say anything, not at first. Just laid an old towel along the base of the window so she could sit without climbing. Added a small step stool by the couch. Began brushing her more often, gently, over the joints that creaked. The vet confirmed what he already knew. Just age, no great illness, no spreading shadow beneath the lungs. Just time, moving as it always does, quiet and unnoticed, until suddenly it isn't. "She's had a good life," the vet said. "Still is." Art nodded. "She brought me back to mine." They walked home slow that day. She in her carrier beside him, dozing. He with one hand resting atop it, thumb stroking the loops in the mesh like a prayer. He documented each shift, not with dread but with reverence. Shorter naps became longer ones. Her tail stilled gradually, a metronome winding down. The house adjusted to her rhythm. Quieter again, but not silent, not barren. He began humming again, not out of reclaimed joy but comfort. Music as soft architecture, something to wrap around her as she slept. At night, he'd place her gently beside him on the bed, adjusting the blanket around her gently curled frame. The final morning came softly, a pink sky. No urgency. She didn't stir from her place by the fire. Didn't lift her head when he called soft, as he always had, "Whiskers." He knelt beside her, speaking not to wake her but because he needed to hear himself say her name again. He touched her cheek. She blinked, slow, gave one small purr, then rested again. At the vet, he held her through everything. He didn't hand her over. Wouldn't she'd come to him trembling, and she'd leave cradled in the same gentleness. The vet said nothing, simply gave him time. It didn't take long. He didn't cry there. He placed her in the towel he'd found her with, still clean, still soft, carried her home, and buried her beneath the lilac tree where she used to nap. In the afternoons, the same tree where she'd first chased a butterfly across the roots. Years earlier, he dug the soil carefully, slow and even, no rush to complete it. He placed a smooth stone at the base after, painted it white, wrote only one word, Whiskers. He sat there long after the sun dropped behind the trees, hands folded in his lap, breath even but heavy. The silence came again, but this time it didn't bring fear. It didn't bring loneliness. His grief was loud when it came. It waited until that night, after the dishes were put away, after the air had cooled. He sat in her spot by the fire, drew his knees up to his chest like a boy, pressed his face into his sleeves, and wept. Pressed sound to memory. Didn't try to hide it from himself. It wasn't the kind of crying that breaks. It was the kind that holds, sobs folded around moments. The storm, the paw on his wrist, the way she used to meow twice before jumping onto the counter. All of it rose and passed through him like a tide, like music from a familiar song that had never played the same way twice. In the weeks after, neighbors brought food, cards, some drew cats in crayon again. He stacked them carefully on the counter, unable to throw them out. People asked how he was doing. He answered, quiet, he would say, but it always came with a smile. He started Whiskers Way in late June. He used his garden as the meeting place, built benches around the lilac tree, invited other veterans to bring their animals if they had them, loaned his voice for the first time in a flyer. A companion can be a lifeline. Sometimes they have fur. The turnout surprised him. 4 cats, 2 dogs, 1 ferret named Lucky. He shared parts of his story, not with performance, not to impress but to offer that sometimes silence needed time, that speaking again didn't come all at once, and sometimes didn't come at all, but connection could still hum in the spaces between. He taught teens now, too. 1 Saturday a month, he welcomed a group from the local high school, kids learning about grief, kindness, service. He read them poems when they asked, short ones, about tales curled over notebooks, little roots of happiness growing where no one had expected. He told them, love doesn't need words, then added, but if the words come, use them. They listened. He let them name the new cat shelter garden. Space. They called it the pause place, because, as one girl said, everyone needs to stop and feel something, sometimes. He laughed at that, told her she'd make a fine poet one day. He didn't eat breakfast alone anymore, not because someone sat beside him, but because something stayed. Something in the echo of Whiskers' quiet muse between bites, in the memory of her paw tapping his spoon seeking cream. She was gone, but she'd never be far. In the early morning, the garden was still, the kind of still that made even the birds pause before singing. Art sat on the small bench beneath the lilac tree, its branches just beginning to bud again. The soil at its base had settled, the stone with her name smooth and clean. A breeze shifted the petals that had already scattered there, and he reached for his notebook, flipping it open with practiced fingers. His pen moved slowly, not hurried, each word considered, like small stones set into a winding path. She came, in through rain, left through sunlight, but stayed in every silence I believed I'd never trust again. He tapped the pen once against the spine of the book, then smiled faintly as something heavy settled and receded again. Not grief this time, not quite. On the porch behind him, a small shape stirred. A calico, young and lean, new to the house, but not to comfort. She stretched, soft and long, then padded onto the railing and dropped lightly to the stone path, trotted to his feet and sat, tail wrapping neatly around her legs. Art looked down at her. "You watching the wind, too?" She blinked her slow blink, that same language of easy trust. He reached down and stroked the top of her head. "She used to do that," he murmured. "You don't have to be her." His hand paused. "But I'm glad you're here," the calico purred. She'd begun doing that almost immediately when she arrived. No shyness or hesitation. Just noise, warmth without permission. He'd found her at the shelter 2 months ago. Not because he was looking, he wasn't. But she had pressed her head into his knee while he was crouched cleaning a water bowl, and it had felt known. Like someone placing a bookmark in the page he thought he'd already finished reading. He didn't name her right away. But that morning, as she curled beneath the lilac tree and placed one paw over her face, he tried out Maple. It hung in the air for a moment, then landed softly in the space between them. He stood after a while and walked inside, the cat following, winding around his ankle like a question he didn't mind repeating. In the kitchen, he reached for the kettle. The morning ritual resumed, quiet and companionable. He poured the water slowly, listening. It had become his habit again to listen. Not just to the world, but for it. He missed her still. Some days more than others. The ache didn't fade. It reshaped, became part of the way he smiled when he remembered her lying in the curl of sun by the fireplace. Part of the chuckle he gave now when his new companion tried to steal his pen mid-sentence, batting it with a too-bold paw. He glanced at the collar hanging on the hook by the back door. Faded pink, the tag shaped like a star, just one word engraved on it. Whiskers. Sometimes he spoke to it while tying his boots. Not in grief, just out of habit. The habits we keep to hold the shape of those we love. He poured a second saucer of milk, one for Maple, one for Memory. They both curled at his feet in different ways. He didn't need to speak much now to be heard. But when he did speak, it came out whole, full of years, lined with moments. Like a voice that had never left, only waited later. He sat in the garden again, Maple asleep in his lap, the sun warm on his shoulders. A breeze tugged at the edge of his notebook. He caught it with 2 fingers, smiling. "It's not about fixing," he said, almost to himself. Just about opening. And then, looking down at the small calico rising and falling with each breath, he said it again. "She didn't say a word, but she gave me back mine."